Good morning, everybody, and welcome, Mark.
Stuart?
After that really quite interesting session, I'm surprised we still have so many people left here. They've not gone out and ordered any stocks, you know. There's a surprise to you.
Maybe I was already doing it on my phone.
Yeah, go on your phone, yeah, right, okay. Let me start. Maybe not so many people know what a SIFMA is. So could you, in 1 minute, explain what a SIFMA is?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Stuart. So we're a trade association focused on capital market development in Asia. We bring together all of the major global sell-side institutions, so the Deutsche Banks, the Goldman Sachs, HSBCs, but also we have a very large asset management group that brings together a lot of the major asset managers in the region, such as BlackRock, and who Belinda just spoke from today. And we really focus, as I say, on that capital market development.
Good, that was very quick. We're here to talk a little bit about the macro landscape for the buy side, particularly focusing on North Asia. And as we're here in Hong Kong, we can look quite closely at that. And inevitably for the securities business, the financial services business, regulation plays an enormous part. As I look at the regulatory environment, all I see is more and more consultation exercises, more and more, I think 6 or 7 from the SFC in the last 4 or 5 months. Singapore is issuing some of these. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, Stuart, that's exactly what we're seeing. And I think that as we saw in the word cloud when we first picked it up, I mean, obviously Trump was one of the major things, but regulation was also another major theme. It was picked up by Belinda, it was picked up in Sanjeev's opening comments as well. It's a major, major theme in this region. And I think what we're seeing is that finally Asia is sort of catching up, unfortunately, with the rest of the world on the back of the global financial crisis. So we've had a lot of this regulation that came out of G20 reforms into Basel, FSB, IOSCO, et cetera, was promulgated, worked its way through the system into US and Europe, and through things like Dodd-Frank, MiFID, which we've already mentioned. But now what we're starting to see is that that's actually working its way into Asia. You mentioned, I think Hong Kong has had, just this year, they've had consultations on fund liquidity risk management, review of the senior manager accountability, online distribution and advisory platforms, unit trust code. So a number of key consultations. Singapore has also had a lot, including on the regulatory sandbox for fintech, new fund structures called Singapore Variable Capital Company, as well as amendments to the collective investment schemes. I think this is a trend that's going to be here for a number of years to come. There's still a lot of this regulation that needs to be promulgated in the region. The trouble is for buy side is that buy side generally here are very, very light in relative to their counterparts in Europe or the United States in terms of compliance, regulatory staff. Quite often, you rely on your head office to do a lot of the work. And then secondly, you've got many, many different countries to cover. So you're not just covering one country or one region like the EU, where most of the regulation comes out of the EU. So it's a real struggle. I think that's where organizations like ourselves and some of the local associations can help. But I think that's a struggle that the buy side is going to have to actually continue with for a number of years. And I think the other thing is that in the past, quite a lot of this was the buy side, and I hate to say this, relied on the sell side to do a lot of the work for them. And I think that trend is pretty much coming to an end as well. I mean, for various different reasons. I mean, the sell side doesn't have the capability to do it anymore. It doesn't have the interest as much. So the buy side's really getting stuck with a lot of this regulation, which really isn't fit for purpose for the region. We can talk about that a little bit later.
I was in a conversation with an international fund management firm that doesn't at the moment is not active in Hong Kong or Asia at the moment. But this was for someone overseas, and they were complaining that the SFC were being deliberately difficult, making life more difficult than they were used to at their home market. But I was wondering, this isn't really the SFC that I see. How do you think the SFC stacks up against other global regulators?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I mean, personally, I don't see the SFC as being a more difficult regulator than the Europeans or the Americans. In some ways, I see them being more accommodating. I think both the SFC and the MAS have a challenge, right? I mean, these cities are financial centers, and they need access to the capital. They need access. They need to be able to actually bring in the firms such as yourselves out here in the audience from the asset managers into these centers to be able to encourage them to operate. And the challenge is that in this environment after the global financial crisis, they've got to be compliant with these global regulations. If they're not compliant or not seen to be compliant, they run the risk of being cut off by the Americans and by the Europeans. A lot of the stuff that they're doing here is because of the extraterritorial nature, and I would say that both in terms of the actual extraterritorial nature of specific European regulations or U.S. regulations like Dodd-Frank or MiFID, et cetera, but it's also what's happened at the global level, because that actually was driven primarily by the U.S. and the U.K. and some of the Europeans.
So IOSCO is pushing that.
IOSCO or the FSB or Basel, all of these regulations were really designed for the developed markets. And so the problem is that what the SFC has to do is kind of take that, put that in place, make sure they get a tick in the box. They're not seen to be an outlier. They're not seen to be too much of a follower, and they've got to do all of that. Then the second challenge they have is China's next door, and China's opening up, and this means that they're stuck between China and the rest of the world. So they want to follow the international regulations, but they've got to be more and more consistent with what China's doing in the medium to long term. That's a big, real challenge for them.
So if I look at what you're saying, that the lead is coming from the big regulators in Europe, US. Ashley Alder is the CEO of the SFC here. He's the head of IOSCO globally.
Right.
Do you think because of that, he's trying to push forward the SFC to catch up in some instances?
I think that's a sense that some people have, is that because he's the chair of IOSCO, SFC is moving faster than, say, MAS is. But I think that MAS will have to catch up. So maybe we're just seeing it a little bit earlier here in Hong Kong than maybe you see in Singapore. I think that Ashley is, because he was chair of the APAC IOSCO committee before taking over the chair of IOSCO, and what we've seen with him and others, Singapore, Australia, Japan, they've really kind of created a group that have actually wanting to push back on that on the agenda of what the U.S. and the EU have set, and that's been somewhat successful. But the problem has been they've come sort of late to the party. I mean, the horse sort of had bolted the stable. A lot of these reforms were already pretty well down the process of being fully baked, and when they've come on to kind of bring a counter message to that, it was pretty much a difficult job for them to do. But I think as things go forward, we're starting to see an easing of those regulations, and understanding that they're not maybe fit for purpose for this part of the world in every case. And so I think that we're kind of seeing, as I say, that immediate trend is going to be much more regulation, especially for the buy side, much bigger impact. But I think if you look to the medium and long term, that trend is probably moving the other direction now.
Now you said that, of course, this slew of regulation that's come to the market is taking up a lot of time, and compliance departments are always being beefed up. There aren't enough compliance staff. Do you feel that the industry can cope with all of this? Obviously, they're hiring more people, but would it be better that there is more industry advocacy towards trying to stop the changes or slow down the changes, or should the industry just sit back and accept what's coming?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I think that we've certainly been very vocal at ASIFMA. I know other trade associations have been as well. That we need to make sure that these regulations are fit for purpose for Asia. We need to be aware that the sheer volume of them, whether they actually make independent sense individually, the sheer volume of them has the capacity to overwhelm the system. Especially in markets which, when you look at from a capital market point of view, are still rather undeveloped in comparison to the U.S. or Europe even. I mean, these are certainly arguments that we make. I think that we would certainly appreciate those in the audience who are represented the buy side to continue to join with us to make those arguments, because I think that we just really need to make sure that we're not ultimately overwhelmed and it's not really being counterproductive, even if they say they make individual sense on their own.
So a good time for lawyers, really.
Well, yeah. I mean, the people that make money out of this are the lawyers, consultants, and I guess the trade associations like us.
We've now got rid of the boring bit. That was regulation.
Yeah.
Okay, we talk about stock markets, and Belinda gave a very interesting presentation on this. I can't help but think that, you know, with stock markets at such high levels, we're getting into bubble territory.
Yeah.
We're not seeing Asia yet up to those very high levels, although it's been picking up quite sharply. Is there a danger here? Should we be concerned, or do you think there's plenty more upside to go?
Well, I think as Belinda put out in her slides, I mean, if you look at what's been going on, I mean, emerging markets have actually underperformed in the equity space over the last number of years, but in the last year have caught up, well, or have had a better year anyway than the U.S. And Europe is in the same, as at a better year in the U.S. So, and I think that actually, in my sense, that's actually a good thing, because they have underperformed. If you look at the PE ratios, you know, Asia still looks good. I mean, it doesn't look overvalued. If you compare emerging market Asia, which I think is about 15 on the PE, the developed markets about 22. The U.S. is a little bit over that. Some developed markets are obviously even more over that. I think that's where the bigger concerns are as compared to Asia. I think going forward, though, you know, there are concerns, and I think Belinda set them out quite well. I mean, China still is a concern. They had a pretty optimistic view on China. I think there can be certainly put forward a more pessimistic view around the debts, around the restructuring that needs to go ahead, whether the pace of that can actually go at a pace that will be able to kind of keep ahead of the growing debt concerns. So I think China certainly is a concern. My personal view, I don't see China blowing up anytime soon. I think even as she noted on her slides, foreign currency loans are still pretty low to foreigners. I think that's one of the things, as anybody who's been through the Asian crisis here will know, is one of the things that easily can trigger a crisis. That's still low, but actually, if you saw on her slides, it's growing, and it's been growing quite substantially in the months ahead, and the months that have just gone by. So if you look at months ahead, that keeps on going. I think that's something to really watch. I think the other thing for Asia is what's going on in the U.S., which I don't think she mentioned. She did. I missed it. Was interest rate rises. I think interest rates are likely to rise, and everybody's calling for them to rise over this year and next year. I think that's going to have a big impact on Asia, and especially in the debt side. You're going to see a lot of sucking sound of money going back to the U.S. What is that going to mean for those that are actually, you know, left holding the bag here in Asia? What is that going to mean for the property markets? What is that going to mean for the property market here, which is, you know, very heavily overvalued, even if maybe supply needs to be more. I don't know how many of those property holders are going to be able to cope with, you know, 6 to 8 rises over the next couple of years.
You think it'll be that many?
Well, that's what a number of people say, right? So I mean, I think it probably will be less. But if it does go 6 to 8, I think, you know, cities like Hong Kong and the property market
So you're identifying some particular triggers that might burst a bubble, but the bubble is still some way to grow.
Well, I think on the equity side, I think it's still got some way to go in the emerging markets for sure. But on the debt side, it's a different story, right? I mean, I've already mentioned related to China, Hong Kong, Singapore. There's a lot of debt here. If you look relative to other emerging markets, so I think that's where the crisis would most likely come from, rather than the equity side.
Now, of course, if markets do well, fund managers are doing well, and the fund management industry does seem to be picking up a lot of new money, although vast amounts of that money are going into exchange-traded and index funds rather than into active funds. What we've also seen is the advent of a number of M&A activities. We've seen Standard Life, Aberdeen, Amundi, Pioneer, and Henderson Janus in the last few months. Some of these have got Asian offices, and they've got duplication. So Do we think there'll be more of these M&A activities? Will there be some, if you like, slowdown in growth, or will there be redundancies? What's your take on where that's going to go?
Well, I guess my take would be, I think that trend will continue. I think it continues in large part because the asset management business is a scale business. And as we talked about right off the opening, because of regulation, costs are going up substantially. So the best way to take cost out is through mergers and acquisitions and through the synergies that you can find there to be able to do that. So I think that trend will continue. So I think there's a possibility within the industry of being more redundancies. Well, at the same time, though, this area of the world is a growth area. So because it's a growth area, it means some of that's going to be balanced by the fact that more money should, in the medium and long term, flow into this part of the world, and there's still a lot of way to grow. There's a lot of growth opportunity here. We mentioned about how the capital markets are still underdeveloped. Our view at ASIFMA is that they'll continue to develop. I mean, we've seen things that are going on, which we talk about in China with the opening up in China. We talked about in India, which Belinda talked about. There's a lot of opportunity here for the markets to grow. That's going to bring more money in for sure. So I think, well, that trend of mergers and streamlining of operations related to that will probably continue. I think it will be offset by these funds growing in the medium.
But what we haven't seen, though, are any mainland China asset managers or even banks, I suppose, trying to buy into the fund management industry internationally, and yet they're getting to be fairly cashed up. So if there's a bit of activity going on, you'd think they would put some money out there. Is there a reason they're not?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, we've seen it in the bank side. So, you've seen CITIC by CLSA, you've seen ICBC by Standard Bank. So that's obviously happened on the sell side, and we expect that to continue. In the buy side, so far, you're right, it hasn't happened. I certainly think that that's probably an area to watch because, as China has done in other industries, they, what do? They buy in technology, they buy in expertise as they grow. So I wouldn't be surprised to, for some of that to happen. Obviously, you've got a big culture issue to kind of deal with any, Chinese asset manager dealing with trying to buy a global asset manager and put them together. And we've seen this in the past with Japan. It hasn't always worked very well when you try to do that. So I think that's the one big question mark is.
But you don't think there'll be any sort of regulatory prevention? There won't be any. Well, there might be complaints, if you like, in Europe or US if a Chinese manager were to try to buy a firm, but it's.
Well, I think we're starting to see a little bit of that. You're seeing even in the latest French election, the new president Macron saying that we need to rethink how open our borders are going to be, and I think that will play a role. I guess it depends on how significant that purchase is, right? I mean, if it's, I would expect that it would probably start in the way that it has on the sell side with the banks, which they're going to pick up smaller entities and not, you're not talking about a major global asset manager or a major global bank. You're talking about something smaller.
Well, no one's going to buy BlackRock, for example.
So I think that will be much more acceptable to whether it's a European audience or an American audience.
And finally, let's talk about China and China Connect. I think we can call it China Connect now that we've got Stock Connect, we've got Bond Connect, we're possibly going to get ETF Connect, and we've got all sorts of other access routes, including a railway and a bridge coming up soon. So is this good for Hong Kong?
Well, look, I think it is good. Hong Kong has been and will probably remain to be that market where China connects through and experiments with. So as you said, we saw it with Stock Connect, we're seeing it with the mutual fund recognition, and now we're seeing it with the bond market. So I think in general, good things are good. More access to China is, I think, what the market wants, and will also bring China more into the international system over time. It's essentially been a market that's kind of evolved independently of the rest of the world, and we've seen this with Stock Connect, threw up a lot of problems around things like beneficial ownership, around DVP, which because they were operating on different norms. I think our view at a SIFMA is that we do have somewhat of a concern, especially on the fixed income side, of a plethora of these type of access points. You have RQFI, QFI, you had the CIMB opening last year with the registration. You could go on and set up a settlement agent. Now you've got Bond Connect. How do they all work together? And are they going to? Do they all have different separate criteria? Are some investors disadvantaged over other investors? One of the things we saw a little bit with the CIBM opening was that if you were in the RQFI, in QFI, you were kind of stuck. You had repatriation limits. You couldn't move your business to the new. The new access program, that actually was penalizing investors that went in first. So we don't want to see that kind of stuff happening in Bond Connect. We want to see basically the standards and criteria be somewhat harmonized and streamlined across the programs and be able to move from one to the other in an easy fashion. I think the other thing with Bond Connect really comes down to, Stock Connect made sense. You're connecting one stock market with another stock market. All the liquidity is really on those two stock markets. Very simple, relatively speaking. Bond markets are extremely fragmented. And
is it not getting a bit late for buying China bonds?
Yeah, so I think, and then you already have that issue, but I mean, which I can come on to in a second. But I mean, CFETS is not is not where the liquidity is in the bond market in China. It's either over the phone with the brokers or even through chat rooms. So our international investors really going to get access to that liquidity. Hong Kong Exchange doesn't have a fixed income platform. So the rumor is they're partnering with one of the big international players. But is that going to be clunky? Is that going to be expensive? You're still going to have to do one of the things you didn't have to do in Stock Connect is your KYC and create credit lines with those onshore. You're going to have to do that. So if you're sitting in Hong Kong or Minnesota or Switzerland, you're still going to have to do this KYC. I think that's going to make this really, really clunky and not as successful as Stock Connect.
Now, we've got a few questions from the audience, and there's still time for a few more questions. They're coming from Anonymous in the fifth row on the left-hand side. As fees continue to be eroded and compliance costs continue to increase, do you see far fewer buy-side firms remaining viable? Will the consolidation continue? You've covered part of that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that is, you see fee pressure, you see cost increase. I think, as I mentioned, asset management is an economies of scale business. So I think we're going to see that trend of those that are large getting larger and others that are likely to merge. I mean, what I don't want to say though is that there's obviously specialist funds that have particularly either good research, good insights, or a particular competitive advantage. I think that they will be here and they will remain. But I think that those kind of in between, there's going to be more and more pressure on.
Anonymous again in the 10th row on the right-hand side. Obviously a Thomson Reuters fan. How is technology helping the asset management industry to protect their margins?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, if you're getting at distribution, then I think that technology has a role to play on the distribution side through online platforms and enabling the clients on the retail side to be able to actually select providers and select funds in a much more efficient way than going through the local banks. We'll have to see how that plays out. We're starting to see that a little bit in China, and you see things like Ant Financial really eating the bank's lunch. So far, that hasn't happened in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, but I think that's the space to certainly watch.
And can they protect themselves? Because obviously we've just had this big scare at the weekend. Are buy-side firms adequately protecting themselves?
You mean in relation to cyber attacks and that? Well, look, I think that cyber attacks are here to stay. I mean, I think what happened over the weekend. I mean, we've been saying as collectively as a global industry that cyber has to be taken a lot more seriously, and it really needs global coordination. What we don't like to see is what's happened recently, where China goes its own way, other countries are doing their own thing, uncoordinated. I think what's happened over the weekend actually, ironically, is a good thing, because what's really started, you already see the G7 responding yesterday and saying we need to set a framework. I think you're going to see a lot more global cooperation that's going to leave the national protectionist tendencies at the door, because what they realize is, if you don't cooperate globally, you don't create strong systems which are able to deal with cyber, you're putting yourself at massive risk. I think inside obviously those who got hit by that probably don't see it as a good thing, but I think from the market as a whole, it is actually a wake-up call, which I think we're already seeing governments respond to.
Okay, well, we have more questions, but I see our time is up. So Mark Austin of ASIFMA, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Thanks.